Okie dokie. It's been a minute since we've read Race to the Truth, Slavery in the African American Story, but let's get back at it. The Door of No Return. But when the castle door finally opened, it was like nothing they had dreamed about. It sealed their uncertain fates on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, and for most of it would never bring them any closer to their loved ones and the way of life they were forced to leave behind. It was the door of no return. Throughout the transatlantic slave trade, millions of Africans would be forced through doors of no return at forts along West African shorelines. It would be the last glimpse of their native land. Today, forts like Elmina in Ghana and Senegal's House of Slaves on Goree Island still remain as reminders of the terrible things that took place there. The Maafa. Maafa is a Swahili term for terrible occurrence or great disaster. It refers to the millions of captured African men, women, and children who perished during the Middle Passages, the forced journey from the west coast of Africa to the shores of Americas. Indeed, what the African people experienced once they arrived at their destination was compounded by the inhumane conditions of the journey itself. As in the castles, they were shackled to one another amid filth, death, vomit, and other bodily waste. Slavers chained them together by their ankles, wrists, and necks. Many women and children and men were separated by sex and forced to sit or lie down, packed tightly into the belly of massive ships without space to move about freely or even relieve themselves in private. Many of them suffered from motion sickness and regurgitated what little food they were given right there in the cramped human cargo space. Others became sick and infected those around them. It was virtually impossible to escape the stench or the sight of human waste, since the enslaved Africans were packed so tightly into the cargo hold, a space designed to carry goods and supplies, not human beings. After many jumped overboard to their deaths, their captors outfitted the massive slave vessels with netting to keep the captives from plunging into the sea. The captives were also brutally flogged, beaten into submission, and branded with the commercial seal of their captors. As horrific and heart-wrenching as this treatment was, it was nothing compared to the life in bondage they faced when they arrived in their new home, America. The nightmare that awaited them on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. Nearly 40% of the enslaved Africans who ended up in the United States and the West Indies disembarked from slave ships on the shores of Sullivan's Island, a barrier island just across the Copper River and near Charleston, South Carolina. Charleston was a thriving port city, made rich off of slave labor and used to cultivate rice, indigo, and cotton. Those stolen Africans who survived the treacherous voyage were forced to quarantine aboard the disease-infested vessels or were moved to pest houses, dwellings used to house those afflicted with communicable diseases such as the plague, on the island, where they were isolated for weeks at a time to ensure they would not infect local residents and prospective buyers with any of the contagious diseases that had already claimed so many of their fellow captives. The time they spent in quarantine was similar to their imprisonment in the slave castles, but it became much worse when they realized they had been transported to a foreign place so very far from home. The anguish they experienced led to deepened depression and despondency. Not only were they separated from their families and their loved ones, but now they had no idea which way led home. if they ever had the chance to return. But life was about to get even worse. Once they were released from quarantine, they were forced to march, shackled and naked, through the streets of Charleston for everyone to see. Men, women, and children were stripped of their meager clothing so that interested buyers could inspect them. It was a humiliating experience. White men and women poked and prodded their bodies, peered into their mouths, and pulled on their limbs and genitals to satisfy their curiosity about the captives' abilities to do manual labor, or, in the case of women and girls, produce offspring. Some white men, also had more insidious plans for the unsuspecting African women and girls. Once they had purchased them, many slave owners physically and emotionally abused the enslaved women and girls they owned. Many of them impregnated enslaved women in the same houses where their wives slept. Of course, the slave owners' behavior angered their wives, but instead of taking their anger out on their husbands, white women directed their wrath at the helpless enslaved women who had no rights and no one to defend them from the predatory power slave owners held over them. Like their male counterparts, white women could inflict cruel torture on enslaved women without recourse. They saw enslaved people simply as property they could handle however they wished. Sarah Bartman and the Venus Hottentrott. White people believed and promoted racist propaganda that explorers and prominent leaders wrote to document their first encounters with Black people in Africa. The explorers' travel logs and diaries are riddled with pornographic descriptions of African men and women they saw during their travels. Many included exaggerated details about their noses, lips, and hair, and many others wrote in great detail about their genitals and posteriors. Take, for example, the case of Sarah Bartman, known as the Venus Hottentrott. Bartman was a Black woman from South Africa whose body was studied by French doctors and scientists and put on display for European people's entertainment during the 1800s. The term Hottentrott was a derogatory slur Europeans used to refer to Bartman's tribe, the Kiowa, and Black people generally. Bartman astounded Europeans because she was afflicted with steatophagia, which basically means she had a big buttocks, Nicki Minaj style, Cardi B style. The illiterate Black woman, who was on her own after losing both her parents when she was very young, fell victim to a scheming con man who promised her steady work in his shows in England. In reality, the man had duped her into signing a contract to perform as a freak in his traveling entertainment shows. Bartman didn't perform at all. Instead, she dressed in tight clothing that accentuated her rear end. The poor woman suffered the gawking and inquiring minds. If that wasn't humiliating enough, rich white people could pay for private viewings during which they could physically inspect her body. Sarah Bartman was objectified by white people for most of her life. They didn't see her as a person. They saw her as a freak of nature, and she piqued their curiosity about African people. For many, seeing her was enough to confirm the racist propaganda that flourished through the 18th century, just as the international slave trade was booming. That's freaking disgusting. There were people who tried to help the vulnerable young woman. In fact, abolitionists and other humanitarians took up her cause, but to no avail. In 1815, she died at the age of 26. Even in death, she continued to be objectified. A Paris museum kept Bartman's brains brain, skeletal remains, and organs on display until 1974. Her experiences of exploitation and objectification are reflective of what enslaved women and girls in the United States experienced on the auction block, in the plantation big house, and in the fields at the hands of white men. I think we will leave it here for today. We will finish this chapter next time, and then there will be some let's think about this questions at the end of this chapter. So thank you for joining me. Like I said, we'll get through this bit by bit, and I'll see you next time. Take care of yourself, drink some water, and I'll see you next time. Bye.